All right, so Docker is probably a term that's been thrown around a significant amount. Docker images, Docker containers, and essentially what it is, it's just a flavor of Linux containers. And the idea behind those is to just have these applications that are running in a contained environment, but using the actual host kernel as opposed to having to spawn a separate kernel, which is the case for a lot of virtualization technologies. So the idea is to use things like C groups and kernel namespaces to isolate a lot of these processes. And so Docker is, in essence, it's an open source project, and it's become very an overused term, I would say. But it's also, it's become a great ecosystem in terms of providing a lot of interesting technologies and things like that. So when we talk about Docker images, we're essentially just talking about the file format that is specifying everything necessary to start the container. Of course, you can start the container a little bit differently, so on and so forth with different arguments. But this is what we're talking about. So the Eclipse Docker Tooling is essentially just usage of the remote APIs that the Docker community is providing. And we're basically just making calls to this and making it all available within Eclipse. This is part of something called the Linux Tools project, and the irony that it's actually part of something, just Linux Tools project, it's not lost on us. The main motivation for this is that from a release engineering perspective, it's much easier for us because myself, Jeff Johnston, who's also given similar talks, and Xavier Coulon, we are all committers on Linux Tools project, and it's easier to just be part of this project and release it for now. This may change in the future. So basically, it's part of the Linux Tools project. Our first release was in Mars, and we aim to just make a better experience for users using Docker from within the Eclipse UI, which is not to say that using it from the command line isn't already. It's decent. It's not bad at all, but we just want to provide the same functionality within Eclipse. So there's a lot of commands that we provide just as part of the tooling. We don't provide all possible arguments, but we're trying to support a lot of different use cases. So for the purpose of this talk, I'd really like to just keep it constrained to things that we have that are new in Neon, and then later on I'll get into some demos, as well as some issues that we face and where we see this going into the future. So one of the things that we have that's new in Neon is the Dockerfile Editor. So initially, our editor was basically just some kind of style text editor, just something to get the job done and allow users, if they're building a Docker image, to be able to edit it on the fly if they wanted to make some changes. So at EclipseCon North America, we actually got in touch with some people from Open Analytics, and they basically suggested their own editor that was just using Eclipse UI. And it just had basic syntax highlighting, auto-completion, and it's something we had on our list in order to do. So we decided to have this contribution as part of the Docker tooling. So I'd just like to demo that for you really fast. So if there's anything that might seem a little confusing just because I'm demoing a kind of newer functionality, don't worry, I'll go over the functionality that exists as well. So from within the Eclipse platform here, if I want to access the Docker tooling, I'll just simply go to open a perspective, and it's available as a separate perspective. So it's called the Docker tooling perspective. And I'll click OK here. There's a couple of views that are important. So obviously you have your Docker images view where you will be able to see all images, and you can essentially pull, start them, stop them, build them, tag, pretty much any functionality you can think of you could find here for Docker images. For containers, similarly, start them, stop them, so on and so forth. And there's various options to kind of filter out intermediary images, things you don't really want to see. And from the Docker Explorer, you can do very similar functionality. It's a little abbreviated, and it's meant just to get things going if you just want one central view for everything. So here I actually don't have a connection, which is why I don't see any containers or images. So I'm just going to click on this here. And you can see that on my particular system, I have a Docker daemon configured over Unix sockets. And so I'm just going to use this. If you wanted to, you could certainly have some TCP connection. It wouldn't even necessarily have to be on the system. It could be part of some virtual environment that is port forwarding that connection, and you can just provide it here. We also have support for Docker machine, but I don't have any Docker machine instances here. And we're always looking to support other virtual environments that are, I guess, providing some kind of Docker daemon endpoint. So I'll just click Finish. And you can see here some of the basic images I have listed, Docker containers as well. I'll just show you that, in fact, we are hiding a lot of images just for the sake of making things a little simpler for users. But I promised you the editor functionality, so let me just get to that. So from here, I'll just click this icon here, which is to build an image. And you'll know that to build an image, I need to give it a name and a directory where I have the Docker file. The Docker file is kind of like a specification of what image I'd like to base it off of and what relevant commands I'd like to supply in order to build that particular image. So if I filled all of this in, I could certainly build, but you may also want to edit the Docker file that you're actually going to use on the fly. So let me just actually bring up a Docker file here from this folder. And we can now actually just click here to edit. And just before we build it, we could possibly edit this. So perfect. Is that a little bit better? Yeah. So we have support for basic auto-completion in this editor. It's not too complicated, but if you ever find yourself kind of not remembering how to type a particular command, you get the hover help just to figure it out and type it away, and support for various commands, and as well syntax highlighting. So I think this has been a step in the right direction, and there's a lot more improvements we can make to this, like auto-completion of images that you have already, things like that. All right. So that's the Dockerfile Editor, and we have it fully integrated now. So this was a little trickier. What I would like to talk about is support for third-party registries. So we always supported pulling, pushing, and even searching, mostly for Docker Hub. So actually, you could pull from pretty much any repository, and the trick is really you have to tag the image. Sorry, you have to, the pull that you specify has to be prefixed with the server address and the port, so on and so forth. And for push, it's a similar case. You need to tag the image with the correct server address and port in order to get it to push to that particular remote instance. So the problem with this is it's not very obvious, and even for command line users, it's very easy to get wrong. So what we decided to do is create a separate field so that we can essentially just, a user can just specify that information and we do everything for them. The other reason is because you can pull and push to registries that require authentication. So you might have a private image on Docker Hub where it's, I think by default for regular accounts, you get one private image that you can have, but you can pull from there with your authentication credentials. And we've added that into Eclipse Secure Storage. So you just type your credentials in as part of preferences, and then you just go from the drop-down box, and you would be able to push or pull from that particular location. So in terms of push and pull, it's not too complicated. Search was a little trickier. The problem with search, if you've ever done a regular Docker search, you kind of see from the command line it says searching Docker Hub. And as far as we could tell, there was no real way to search an arbitrary registry that we wanted to define, at least not through the remote API. So one way we were thinking about this is if you change the actual registry that the Docker daemon is defined with, then you could have this. But there's a lot of strong opinions about why this is terribly wrong and you should never do something like that. But it doesn't remove the need to search actual remote registries. So although the remote API doesn't have the capability to do this, version 1 registries and version 2 registries certainly have standard GET requests, and you'll get a JSON string. Not always formatted uniformly, but it's certainly possible to do. And this is what we ended up doing for searching third-party registries and so forth. So I'll just show that functionality as well. So for now, the way we actually access search is through pull, because generally when you're pulling is the opportunity you usually want to search for a particular image. So in order to do this, because I obviously don't have an internet connection, I actually have a container here, which is essentially a version 2 registry, and I'm just going to start it up. And you can see at the bottom here as well, I have the logs that are associated with it, and so this is functionality that has always existed, but you can kind of see I can pause, I can stop it. So I have this registry started up, and it's important to figure out how I can access it. So what's happening is connections on the local system to port 327.68 are being forwarded to the container, the container's port 5000. So if I want to access this registry, it's just going to be localhost :327.68. So I can go to pull here, and that's the little button I pressed here. I believe I could have also just right-clicked here and gone to pull. There's multiple ways to access this. So by default, pull will be the Docker Daemon registry, which is Docker Hub by default. But we don't want to do that. So we want to go to localhost :327.68. And we'll do a search here. And I pushed a bunch of images actually to this local registry under me. So I just took standard docker.io, I tagged it as something else, and so now we can simply just search this registry, and we could even pull images from here if we wanted to. So let's take something like me registry and just pull it. And you'll see this is actually one of the issues because the format we get back is a little different. We don't know what the actual ID is for the layer, but it's still possible to pull it. We'll just click finish. So this is actually happening almost instantaneously. And the reason for this is because I have the same image ID locally. It's just essentially tagging it with the tag that I had from that registry, which is here. So this is essentially pulling and searching. If I want to push, so I believe BusyBox I did not have there. Actually, let me just push it directly. So I'll just click BusyBox, and I'll go to push here. I can specify a different tag if I had one, but let's just say localhost :327.68. And I can push this. And so you probably saw the update here in the logs, but we can just simply pull. And it was BusyBox. And we have it here in the registry So the other thing I'd like to mention is, of course, if you have, I didn't show authenticated connections, but if you wanted to have an authenticated connection, pushing or pulling, all you would have to do is just go into Windows, Preferences, expand Docker here, and under Registry Accounts, you would simply provide the server address and port for the third-party registry or Docker Hub itself that you're pushing or pulling to, username, email is optional, and password. And from there, anytime you did a pull or push, you would simply have that reference here, and it would show up. There's still a lot of improvements to be done to this, but I really think it's a good step in the right direction to providing a lot of functionality that people are going to want. So that's essentially pulling, pushing, and searching for third-party registries. So the final thing I'd like to mention, I think on the Docker tooling side, is Docker Exec support. So most images, when you start it and it's a container, the service by default is running in the foreground. I've had a lot of cases where I'll start the service in the background and I'll have the process actually be a shell. That way, when you start it up, you can just get a shell directly into it. But there's a lot of containers out there where you start them up and it'll just be that particular service. In those cases, it's still very useful to be able to get a shell or some kind of environment into the actual container to just see what's going on, in essence. So I'd just like to demo that really fast right now. So I have this registry container here, which is started up. Of course, by default, it's just printing out log messages. So had I had something running in the background, and if the shell was the entry point, I could have just had -i-t when I started it up here. Sorry, so from startup here, I could have added -i-t and get a shell into it. But because I just have it displaying logs, I can't do that. But what I can do on a started container is I can right-click on it, and I can hit execute shell. And this just gets you, it's essentially the target management project it has a bunch of different, I guess, almost like shell providers. You can do it for SSH and for various things. So we just use the input stream and the output streams that we're taking from the container, and we're passing them to this terminal. And so you're actually inside this container, and you can see the registry process that's running inside here, and so really useful to just be able to quickly debug issues with this. All right. So now I'd like to move on to Vagrant. So unfortunately, Vagrant project hasn't really seen too many contributions for Neon, and mainly this is because I've just been working a lot on the Docker tooling stuff, and a lot of us committers as well. So for Vagrant, I'm just going to quickly go over it and show you sort of what's there and a nice functionality between Vagrant plugins and Docker tooling that you could potentially use. So Vagrant I like to think of as just kind of a wrapper, a high-level wrapper around whatever hypervisor is running for the system. So whether you're using libvirt with KVM or Zen or VirtualBox or even Docker containers, you could be running Vagrant and just issue one uniform command that will get delegated to whichever hypervisor. Vagrant also supports a similar kind of specification as Docker. They're called Vagrant files. And in Vagrant files, it's essentially, it's almost like a Ruby variable assignment language. It's very basic, and it's just defining a configuration for when you're bringing up your virtual environment. Vagrant files can exist at many different levels. You can have system ones per user. There can already be one associated with a virtual environment, many different levels. But we wanted to create a kind of Vagrant plugin for Eclipse to allow users to just instantly bring up virtual environments, share them, and yeah. So I'll just show you quickly the Eclipse Vagrant Tooling. So again, it's accessible from a perspective, but we also have a toolbar item contribution for cases where you're developing and you don't want to switch perspectives. You just want to issue a quick, get this virtual machine up and running without almost switching tasks too much. But I'll show you the perspective as well. So I'm just going to go to Vagrant Tooling here. And this is just informing me that if you're using libvirt, sometimes with systems that package libvirt, there's additional configuration you need to have proper permissions to create virtual environments. I have this set up here, this is not a problem. So again, you can view Vagrant boxes, Vagrant virtual machines here. So what I'll quickly do is I'll just bring up a virtual environment, and I could do this from this view here, or again from this toolbar item at the very top, which is available from any perspective. Sorry, any perspective. So very basic way to get this going is to just give a virtual machine name and a box reference, and it'll bring everything up. You can also specify a custom Vagrant file, which will do everything for you. And you just have to link to a Vagrant file on the system, which is what I'll actually do now. So the Vagrant file I'm specifying here is for the Atomic Developer Bundle. And this is essentially just a virtual environment that ships the Docker Daemon and a bunch of other tools just to make it really easy to develop Docker containers and Docker images. So I have the Vagrant file here. I'll just click Finish. And you can see it's bringing up the machine. So if it's coming up rather quickly, it's not because it has anything to do with Vagrant doing extra work or anything like that. It's a pretty small image, so should be up much faster. Should show up in the Vagrant VMs view here. And we should also see that if we didn't have this view and we just wanted to access the machine from another perspective, we could perform various commands on it, stop, destroy, we could SSH into it, we could open the Vagrant file that corresponds to it. Very simple, nice one that we have for now is SSHing into the virtual environment. So we just click SSH, and we're inside here, and I think we'll find we have a Docker daemon running. So One potential workflow that we could have is for on a Windows or Mac OS machine, and we have this environment that has a Docker Daemon and all these other tools, we could access it. So there's a plugin that you need, and this is one of the few times I'll go to the command line, because we're planning on getting this functionality in eventually. But let me just go into downloads. So the plugin I need to do this is called Vagrant Service Manager. And all it's doing is it's essentially just looking inside that particular virtual environment and giving me what is being exposed. In this case, I'll find that I have a Docker daemon. And so I just type in Vagrant Service Manager env. I think I could be specific and say Docker. And I'll get the host machine, the host on which, so I'll get the IP address on which I can access the Docker daemon. So what's happening is the virtual environment, so sorry, I'll bring this up. So I have Project Atomic ADB, which is a virtual environment, and inside there I have a Docker daemon. The Docker daemon's port is essentially being forwarded so that it's available outside to the actual virtual machine. And from there, I can access it from my host system. So I'll just copy this link here, this IP. Whoops. I will switch to the Docker tooling perspective. Let me bring up the other view, so Docker images and containers. And I'll create a new connection. So I don't want a Unix connection, I want a TCP connection. Let's call it Vagrant. And I need a certificate as well. Oops. There. So let's see if that works. Yeah. And so on this particular connection, I haven't pushed anything or pulled anything. I just brought it up, so there's nothing that's really available. I could potentially pull or push or populate this ahead of time, things like that. But this is the kind of workflow we also want to work on. We want to support other ways in which Docker daemons are being exposed and make it easier for users to just instantly access these. Yep, so this is essentially what I needed, just Vagrant Service Manager and then the command. So this is one of the things we're hoping to integrate into the tooling. So for the future of Vagrant tooling, there's a lot of stuff we're hoping to doing. In particular, we want to have better support for modifying the resources of that particular system, so memory and CPU usage. So right now, the only way to do that is essentially inside your Vagrant file. And essentially, someone has to have written that and gone in there and done the specific cases for so libvirt and VirtualBox and any kind of hypervisors that someone wants to support. If someone's already done that and you have the Vagrant file, it's very easy. You just supply the Vagrant file. Also, having provisioners for things like shell and file. I think shell is really important because once we support essentially a user writing a shell script and having that run as part of the startup, a user can pretty much configure their Vagrant environment however they want to. And of course, what I showed you, so the Vagrant Service Manager stuff, we'd like to make it so that if you have a Vagrant box that's up and it's providing some Docker daemon through the Atomic Developers Bundle, it'll just show up in terms of discovery, similar to how it would work for a Docker machine. For Docker tooling, big on our list is Docker Compose. So it's become very common to see projects, whether it's at GitHub or wherever, shipping Vagrant files and Docker files as part of that project, essentially telling users, if you want to try this out and your system libraries don't exactly match up, you don't want to build from source, check out this Docker file or check out this Vagrant file, or even pull from Docker Hub and just start this up and it'll be exposed on this port and instantly try it out. For more complicated examples where you have a front-end service, database, and so forth, you might end up writing a Docker Compose file. So we'd like to be able to support this use case, and so support Docker Compose. As well, we currently support C++ applications for running and debugging. So through the CDT, the C++ development tooling, There's support so that if you create a C++ application, you can deploy it directly into a running container if everything matches up. And if the container also has a GDB server running on there, you can actually debug your application within that container. So we want to bring that support to other languages wherever possible and expand that. We want to add support for networking as well. More recent releases of Docker have added API for creating different virtual interfaces and things like that. So your containers aren't all in on the same interface, on the same kind of network. And as well, we'd like to be able to improve our API. So not just in terms of core API for making stuff a little easier for people who want to do a push to a particular registry, rather than using the lower level Spotify Docker client Java API, which is what we use, they could use some of our core API to just do that. But as well for certain UI wizards and dialogues that we have made available and that we have been getting questions about in terms of other projects that would like to use these just as a quick kind of push to this repository or pull from this one. All right. So I'd just like to quickly go through the issues we've had in the past and onward with respect to Docker tooling. So the remote API evolves very, very fast. And a lot of the times we face issues where we'll have a release and we're supporting the latest and greatest API. But by the time a point release for Eclipse rolls around, before that, there's newer versions of the API that have been released, and they could potentially break us when users update. So only alternative is essentially we fix it, in our nightlies and have users get it, or simply we need to migrate to a different kind of release schedule. So that's been one of the main issues, just supporting the latest Docker remote API. Another issue has been the library that we use in Java for all of this functionality, for making the calls to the daemon. It is very active, but there's no strict release versioning guidelines. So we'll very often find ourselves, updating even like having a micro version bump and seeing potential API breakage and things like that. So that can be an issue, and yeah. And in terms of the Vagrant tooling, again, we're basically just calling Vagrant from the command line, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong with that. Vagrant does support a machine-readable option to potentially make the output more parsable, but not all Vagrant commands actually support this option. And the other issue is that depending on the hypervisor that you're using under the covers, so whether it's libvirt with KVM or VirtualBox, there are potentially different issues that can become exposed. And so you might have a case where you're doing Vagrant package, and on VirtualBox it just works fine. But on libvirt, because it's integrated with the system, you need to ensure that wherever that image exists has proper permissions so that you can write to, and so on and so forth. So there are issues even with Vagrant as well. And one of the bigger issues actually is, if you look here, these are essentially the committers for Docker tooling and Vagrant. There's really not a lot of us, and so it's difficult to handle all the bugs that exist or anything like that. We're actually very grateful for even the bugs that we do get, and being able to support Windows, Mac OS, and Linux as well. We're doing the best that we can in making sure that we have functionality and we have something that is stable and usable. But at times it can get very difficult just because of the reduced amount of people we have contributing. But contributions don't just have to come in the form of a patch. They can just as easily be spawning some functionality that you don't think is working the right way or you think could be improved. How am I for time? Oh, good. All right, so we're also on the Eclipse Marketplace. So you can get it, Docker tooling or Vagrant tooling, directly on there. And once Eclipse Neon is released, I'm sure we'll update all of this and have it there. And these are some of the resources. So, the user guide for Vagrant, Docker tooling, all of that. And with that out of the way, if there's any questions, I'd love to be able to take them. We have a couple minutes. Any questions? No? All right. Yes? So it's something called a Project Atomic /ADB. It's essentially a Vagrant box that is shipping Docker Daemon, and I don't know the exact details, but it's shipping a lot of different tools. One of the ones that I really care about is the fact that it's shipping a Docker daemon in there. And for workflows like Windows or Mac OS, it's very easy to get a Vagrant box up and running there and just use the Docker daemon through that. As well, because you can ship other things within that Vagrant environment, it's a very interesting case. I would think it's similar to what is offered by the CDK, so the Container Development Kit, as part of the developer program. Yeah. Other questions? No? All right, well, thank you very much.